My name is Peter Joseph, and I've been working for the past 10 years in the hope to see some meaningful, long-lasting change in this world. A long 10 years it's been.
The New Human Rights Movement, Reinventing the Economy to End Oppression by Peter Joseph. I wish to clarify that throughout this work, various terms will be used to reference our current economic mode. Free market, capitalism, market system, market economy, and market capitalism will be used in both a detailed and generalized context. In the past, I have deliberately not talked about my life history or myself in any real way, as I generally find it inhibiting to an audience's judgment.
Hi, I'm Sam Harris, author of Letter to a Christian Nation and The Moral Landscape and the End of Faith.
The third Enlightenment ideal, I suggest, is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings. Well, advancing human flourishing, who could be against that? That sounds rather trite. But in fact, there are many distinct alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical force, dialectic struggle, or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. This is another key Enlightenment theme.
Now, what exactly is humanism? To put it very simply, humanism is the idea, the belief, that human feelings are the ultimate source of authority. When we confront any big question or dilemma in our personal lives or in our collective life as a society, humanism expects the feelings and free choices of human beings to provide us with an answer.
Now, by default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our genetic relatives, our close friends and allies, cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, such as education, journalism, art, mobility, and reason.
Humanism tells us to listen to ourselves, to follow our heart, to be true to ourselves. And since no one can understand my feelings and free choices better than me, no one should have absolute authority over me, over my life.
As soon as I enter into conversation with you, I can't insist that only my interests are special just because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously.
And you get the sense that there's nothing that one side can say to the other, let's say on the...
So the left wing fails and the right wing don't care.
Yeah, that's right. That's fundamental.
So we need to
They also don't see the danger sufficiently.
Poverty could easily be resolved both through financial means and through efficient use of resources with modern methods. But we don't do it because of the way the economic structure is organized, its incentives, its procedural dynamics, you could say.
I think that is the solution to the problem. It's like, I don't think the solution to the problem of inequality is sociological. I think it's psychological.
And that is, of course, a big subject in the book. And I really hope people will begin to understand more so that poverty is really just a form of violence coming down from our social system, doesn't need to exist, and we should work to change it.
I mean, partly what I'm...
Why? Because it's closer to essence? Because it's more essential? Or because
Why?
a society has to be a reflection of individual psyches or collective psyches? Why is it psychological?
I think the temptation towards resentment and destruction that's associated with sociological approaches to inequality is too great.
Inequality drives crime. Now, you can argue about why, but the fact that it does, that's not disputable. So we could have an intelligent discussion between the left and the right, and the discussion would go something like this. You need innovation, you pay for innovation with inequality. But you need to bind inequality because if it's too intense, then things destabilize. It's like, okay, we could agree on that. We've got the parameters set. Now we have to start thinking very carefully through how to do the redistribution issue, and we don't know how to do that. So you might say, well, we have a guaranteed annual income for people, which I think is a horrible solution, by the way, but it addresses the right problem. The problem is that we're hyperproductive, but the spoils go to those at the top, And some of those resources need to be funneled down to the people who have zero.
But, as per Thomas Piketty's observations, a large tax on the wealth of the super-rich would be an obvious start. This step would also directly assist the reduction of economic inequality, which, in and of itself, is a dire imperative in order to improve public health and stabilize society.
One of the things that you'll find if you look at creative production in any domain, it doesn't matter, artistic domain, food production, novels written, novels sold, money generated, number of companies generated, number of goals scored in hockey, etc. Number of paintings painted, number of compositions written, anything like that, where the fundamental underlying measure is human productivity, what you find is that a very tiny percentage of people produce almost all the output.
Any debate about the importance of the ownership class's role as job creators.
So that means if you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work, but if you have 10,000 employees, 100 of them do half the work. So that they have an opportunity to at least get to the point where they can innovate, and so the whole bloody thing doesn't wobble and fall. And and I would say in some sense that's what the political discussion is about.
And hence the need for upper-class tax breaks and the like.
Right. It's a very, very vicious statistic. And you won't learn about that in psychology for reasons I have no idea about.
A large tax on the wealth of the super-rich would also directly assist the reduction of economic inequality, which, in and of itself, is a dire imperative in order to improve public health and stabilize society.
Well, imagine that in order for society to progress, you have to allow the individual to compete in a relatively untrammeled space so that they can innovate. And then imagine that one of the consequences of that innovation is that you get these Pareto distributions developing, because the innovator or the one who's second in line to the innovator, whatever, ends up with the bulk of the spoils.
Any debate about the importance of the ownership class's role as job creators.
So you might say there's a cost to be paid in inequality for innovation.
Can finally be rejected permanently on the grounds that the focus of society is no longer on creating jobs, but on removing them in favor of more efficient means.
And then you could also say, well, too much inequality destabilizes things, which seems to be quite clear. So there's room for an intelligent conversation about that, right?
You get the sense that there's nothing that one side can say to the other, let's say on the...
Because the lefties say, uh-oh, too much inequality. And they need to be listened to, because the evidence is quite clear. If you let the inequality ramp up enough, the whole system destabilizes, because the people at the bottom think, fuck it, we'll just flip the system upside down.
Right.
No one wants that.
And you get the sense that there's nothing that one side can say to the other, let's say on desirability of raising or lowering taxes. You get the sense that there's nothing that they could say to the other. There's no panel of economists marshaled on either side or in between that could get the two camps to persuade one another.
But we've skittered off into these radical oversimplifications, which is something like, well, if you have more than another person, you're an oppressor and you're evil, and if you have less, it's because you're virtuous and victimized, and that's just a non-starter.
And there have to be right or wrong answers in this space about, in the question of what to do vis-a-vis taxes. There's something about this breakdown of self-criticism and intellectual honesty and an openness to rational argument that is, while we celebrate it in the ivory tower and in public discourse generally as this common tool we use all the time, we rely on it as this is essential, rational discourse, rational argument, this is the best of us.
My goal is not to impose conclusions from the position of authority, but to show the reasoning or train of thought that arrives at those conclusions.
I think I can count on one hand the number of times in my life I've seen someone stripped of their cherished opinion in real time, under pressure, in the face of counter-argument.
So what is humanism in practice? Let's look at several different fields. Let's look first at politics. What is humanist politics? Humanist politics believes that the voter knows best, and governments should serve the voter. If you encounter any big political question, you should ask the voters what they feel about it. The feelings of the voters are the highest political authority.
Anderson, this night is turning out to be a real nail-biter.
All along, the Trump campaign has been saying that Florida's a must-win for them.
Absolutely.
And I mean,
they can't win without it.
Donald Trump will carry the state of Florida.
You know, no. They went to each and every British citizen and asked him or her, how do you feel about it? And when the citizens said they felt like leaving the EU, there was no higher authority that could tell them your feelings are wrong.
I wouldn't call anything encouraging for Hillary Clinton at the moment, to be honest with you, my friend.
Wolf, the scene here is so different than it was a few hours ago when people were happy and relaxed. I have been looking around the room at people who are stone-faced. Some of them have been crying.
That's humanist politics. The voter knows best. Now, what is humanist economics? Humanist economics says that the customer is always right.
I just want a little breakfast.
Well, you can call me Miss Folsom if you want to.
Sheila, we stop serving breakfast at 11:30. Rick, have you ever heard the expression, the customer is always right? Yeah. Yeah, well, here I am, the customer.
And businesses serve the customer. How do you know if a product is good or bad? It depends on the customers. It's very, very simple. A good product is a product customers buy. A bad product is a product customers don't buy. It's as simple as that. If you make a product and you're convinced it's the best thing in the world, but nobody buys it, it means it's a bad product. You can't come to the customers and say your feelings, your choices are wrong.
That's not our policy. You have to order something from the lunch menu.
I don't want lunch. I want breakfast.
Yeah, well, hey, I'm really sorry.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm really sorry, too.
Get a gun! Let's get organized. Calm down. Just calm down, everybody.
At least if you believe in humanist economics.
But what it goes to show is this incentive fallacy we have, that no one's going to do anything unless there's a monetary reward is short-sighted. People will do tons of things if they think it comes back and helps them, and even more so, the great secret of humanity, people love to do things that help others. They really do.
And that's kind of true, but it's not completely true. So that's part of that.
No, because we're not all, because of course, what like from a leftist perspective would be that we're not starting with from a level playing field.
Well, and the system isn't perfect at selecting.
This is why I think a spiritual solution, but something that is beneath or beyond material, is the only way that true progress is likely to be achieved.
But when you look at the amount of wealth on this planet, in material terms, I'm not just talking about money, but even if you look at the money, it's pretty staggering, you know. We all know about the inequality statistics. I won't go into that.
I was thinking of this, something that you said before about, we were talking briefly about kindness and compassion, and it occurs to me, and this is, I'm sure, very simplistic, but the heroism itself, by which I mean sacrifice, the willingness to sacrifice yourself for a greater idea. What excites me about that idea, and I believe why the phenomena is so loaded, is if someone is willing to die for something, it's that they believe it's bigger than them, or in fact that their self is not the truest thing, that there is something greater. If I will give my life for another person, it's almost an acknowledgement of oneness, the temporalness of the individuated self. And we all work so hard to achieve individuation, and I'm sure much of your work as a clinical psychologist is guiding people towards it. But for me, it is just a temporary resting place, because having had the kind of experiences of personal humiliation, annihilation, success, failure, decimation, like, you know, all of these things, that what I've been led to and what I continue to struggle with is how do I serve? How am I of service? How do I help people?
Poverty could easily be resolved both through financial means and through efficient use of resources with modern methods. But we don't do it because of the way the economic structure is organized, its incentives, its procedural dynamics, you could say.
I think that is the solution to the problem. It's like, I don't think the solution to the problem of inequality is sociological. I think it's psychological.
And that is, of course, a big subject in the book. And I really hope people will begin to understand more so that poverty is really just a form of violence coming down from our social system, doesn't need to exist, and we should work to change it.
I mean, partly what I'm
Why?
trying
Because
to...
it's closer to essence? Because it's more essential? Or because
Why?
a society has to be a reflection of individual psyches or collective psyches? Why is it psychological?
I think the temptation towards resentment and destruction that's associated with sociological approaches to inequality is too great, and that as a consequence, those movements tend inexorably to become corrupt and destructive.
It has been difficult to crack the vault of mainstream dialogue.
And so it's incredibly consequential that we don't have more humility and more openness to radical changes of opinion in the public sphere, because what then happens is a complete failure of decision-making and policy-making.
While I certainly have done my homework over the past decade, exploring hundreds of texts on social theory, history, and economics.
So I'm going to try to get a neuroscientific handle on it probably sometime in the next 12 months.
I have no plaques or honorary degrees to impress you with. Given the emphasis our society places on perceived authority, the cynicism I often sense is not surprising. It is also natural that in our fast-paced, time-deficient world, most people simply want someone to tell them what to think.
In the 20th century, in the past century, humankind has really managed to do the impossible and rein in famine, plague, and war.
Likewise, with the shift to labor automation and efforts to maximize zero marginal cost, the value of goods will drop in general, causing positive deflation of prices directly. This means less income will be needed, in general, to purchase the same amount of goods. It's also important to express that when people criticize UBI by asking where the money will come from to begin with, they forget that wealth is not money.
And finally, in our brief survey of what humanism is, what is humanist education? Humanist education teaches people to think for themselves.
Yet there's a serious problem here, as there is a tendency by modern academia to perpetuate existing normative assumptions, especially when it comes to socioeconomic theory.
Right? That's not moral, and it's not decent, and it's also not true. The fact is that while the left decries income inequality, the evils of capitalism, since 1994, the world extreme poverty rate has been sliced in half by increased capitalism and by free markets.
Most people who rise through the ranks of orthodox higher education experience an almost inevitable process of indoctrination. As with many cultural matters, so much has been presupposed about our way of life over time.
And in past generations, in past eras, like in the Middle Ages, the main aim of education was to teach people what the wise books or the wise men of the past thought, what the Bible said, what Aristotle said, because this was the main source of authority.
People tend to assume the social institutions around them are all there is and ever was.
But what is the zeitgeist movement? So you have all this poverty, which I believe is a function of too much government in the areas that are impoverished. But you have this poverty, you have this income inequality, which is always going to be there. You're always going to have income inequality because nobody is equal. But
values become entrenched, identities become locked, and dogma is cultivated.
Right? I mean, the free markets that are now being bashed left and right, those free markets are the greatest innovation in the history of humanity when it comes to the economy. It's why you have nice stuff.
So let's talk for a moment about the primacy of reason. Now, why is reason so good? How is reason something that either must be defended by everybody, even if they don't, even if they're not aware of it, or actually needs no defense?
The prevailing intelligentsia is far from exempt from this normalizing process, and sometimes one needs to exist far outside the box to make a difference.
But when humanism rose, the purpose of education changed. Humanism says that authority comes from within yourself, not from outside. And therefore the main aim of education, at least in humanist societies, changed. And if you go to a teacher from kindergarten to university, and you ask, what are you trying to teach your students? So the teacher would say, I try to teach history, or chemistry, or physics, but above all, I try to teach them to think for themselves.
Well, by the very act of asking the question, you've kind of answered it because you've asked me for reasons. The fact that we're seeking to answer that question, in fact, any question, by stating propositions, questioning them, evaluating them, as opposed to, say, by who can mount the bigger posse, who can shout the loudest.
Because this is the ultimate source of authority.
Who can bar the door to who else, bribery, beauty contests.
So this is humanism. And it has dominated our world for quite some time now.
The fact that we have abjured those ways of deciding which beliefs to embrace, but instead are asking questions and seeking answers, means that we're already committed to reason.
But in the early 21st century, humanism is facing an enormous challenge. Humanism again says that authority comes from our feelings, which reflect our free will, which nobody besides us can really understand. But science now tells us with greater and greater force and authority that this is all a myth. This simply isn't true. There is no free will. It's a myth. Feelings don't reflect free will. Feelings are biochemical algorithms. And given enough data and enough computing power, an external system can understand me much better than I understand myself. The big idea of our era, whether we like it or not, the big idea of our era is that organisms are algorithms, and algorithms can hack organisms, including Homo sapiens. It's just another organism. In the universe, there are only two kinds of processes. There are deterministic processes, and there are random processes. And randomness isn't freedom. That's very, very clear. We are not familiar with anything in the universe which can be described as a free process. Free will, as far as we understand today, is an empty concept that doesn't describe anything in reality or in nature. Humans certainly have desires. They have a will. But they are not free to choose their desires, to choose their will. And their feelings, therefore, don't reflect any kind of free choice or free will. And certainly their feelings, according to the life sciences, are not some spiritual quality that God gave only Homo sapiens in order to appreciate beauty and in order to make moral judgments. No. All animals, all mammals, all birds have feelings. And these feelings evolved by natural selection.
Also, I wish to remind the reader that what follows assumes the overall sanction of society, meaning the majority would seek these changes with little political or establishment resistance. Needless to say, as will be stated at the end of this brief exploration, the truth is that things will never be so easy.
Socialists have or want what you have. I, for one, work hard, pay taxes, believe in capitalism, and have no plan to move to Venezuela or Sweden.
Now, just as the authority of the algorithms might come to replace the customer and the worker in the economic sphere, they might also come to replace the authority of the voter in the political sphere. Democracy is ultimately based, as we said earlier, not on human rationality, but rather on human feelings. In elections, voters are not really asked, what do you think? They are asked, how do you feel? And if algorithms can hack human feelings and manipulate and predict human feelings, then democracy is likely to become an emotional puppet show.
The move from human labor to automation could be made by the use of a universal basic income, UBI, and the strategic shortening of the workday, as touched upon prior. It is a matter of replacing lost income from increased automation through compensating adjustments. The source of the universal basic income is open to debate.
There are ways in which this can be mitigated by some democratizing force, where everyone has access to this technology. But I think ultimately we need something like a universal basic income. There has to be some way to distribute this kind of technological wealth more fairly to the rest of the world. And how you do that is the difficult question, but that you need to do that at some point seems to me to be a very easy question.
Do you think that there's a real problem with something like a universal basic income? You think it's a horrible idea?
Well, I think the idea that the solution is a basic income is not a good idea, because I think the problem is deeper than that. I don't think the fundamental problem is that people don't have enough money. I think the fundamental problem is that human beings in some sense are beasts of burden, and if they're not provided with a place where they can accept social responsibility, social and individual responsibility in an honorable manner, they degenerate and die. That's the opiate crisis in the West right now. Like, men who are men don't need money. They need function.
As will be detailed, the character of our social system favors preservation and elitism. Social dominance and the facilitation of social control and oppression is structurally codified in the system, a normative function born from its inherently competitive, scarcity-driven ethic. Given this, the odds of any kind of easy transition are slim.
One of my heroes, Margaret Thatcher, put it best when she said, "The trouble with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money."
So let me get this straight. You are telling me that the free market allows for buying and selling of the very mechanisms designed to regulate the free market? That is correct, sir. The free market includes the freedom to take away the market freedom of others through the act of competition. Well, I'm sorry to break it to you, John, but not everything in this world can be bought and sold. Our society was not set up to benefit those with the most money. Your sentence is 15 years in jail or a $50 million fine. The judge then drops his gavel in a bold sign of dignity and satisfaction. John pauses, grins in amusement, and pulls out his checkbook. He pays the full fine, gets in his Ferrari, and goes back to his mansion in time for a dinner party. Welcome to the true free market. I call this the paradox of free trade. This paradox points out that to decide what is and is not for sale in the market is entirely subjective. Who is to decide if buying an apple is any different from buying government policy? The truth rests in the contradiction. Either we have a real, pure free market that requires no respect for law, buying and selling anything and everything, or we don't have a free market and never possibly could. For the act of buying and selling the mechanisms used to regulate the free market, or simply interfering in general through monetary means, will always be a problem, voiding the logic of its idealized foundation.